Imagine for a moment that everything you think you know about reality is an elaborate illusion, a theater set constructed with such terrifying precision that it is impossible to tell the wood from the cardboard props. Imagine that your senses, those guides you consider infallible, are actually traitorous spies whispering lies into your ear from the day you were born. The ground you step on, the warmth of the sun on your skin, even the face you see in the mirror every morning could be mere projections of a deep dream or, worse yet, the deception of a powerful entity dedicated to confusing you. This fundamental paranoia is not the script of a contemporary science fiction movie, but the starting point of one of the boldest intellectual journeys in human history. We find ourselves in the 17th century, a period of long shadows and crumbling truths, where one man decides that the only way to find firm ground is to blow up everything he thinks he knows. That man is René Descartes, and his map for this journey is the Discourse on the Method. To understand the magnitude of what Descartes attempted to do, we must place ourselves in his historical context with microscopic precision. The world of 1637 was not the orderly and scientific world we know today. It was an intellectual battlefield where the old guard of scholasticism, a system of thought that blended Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, was losing its grip on reality. The invention of the telescope and Galileo's discoveries had shown that the heavens were neither perfect nor immutable. The authority of the church and ancient Greek texts was being questioned by the direct observation of nature. In this climate of radical uncertainty, where the compasses of thought no longer pointed north, Descartes emerges not as an academic locked in an ivory tower, but as a soldier, a traveler, and a seeker of certainties. The Discourse on the Method was not born as a dry treatise for specialists, but as the preface to 3 scientific essays on dioptrics, meteors, and geometry. What makes this text revolutionary is that it is written in French, the language of the people and the court, and not in Latin, the technical language of the universities. Descartes wanted to speak to the common reason of every human being, not just the doctors of the church. His work is, in essence, an intellectual autobiography. He invites us to walk by his side as he tells us how, after graduating from one of the best schools in Europe, the College of La Flèche, he realized that the only thing he possessed was a mountain of doubts and the suspicion that books only serve to hide our ignorance under elegant words. This dissatisfaction led him to abandon the classroom and throw himself into the book of the world. Descartes spent years traveling, observing the customs of different peoples, serving in armies, and meeting people from all walks of life. What he discovered in his travels was that what one culture considered a sacred truth, another saw as ridiculous madness. This cultural relativity plunged him into an even deeper skepticism. If the wisest men of each nation could not agree on the basics, how could he be sure of anything? It was then that he made the most radical decision of his life, to lock himself in a stove-heated room, far from the distractions of the world, to rebuild the edifice of knowledge upon a foundation that no doubt could tear down. This is where we enter the heart of his proposal, the famous 4 rules of the method. These rules are the basis of what we know today as critical thinking and scientific methodology. The first rule is that of evidence. It consists of never accepting anything as true that is not evidently known to be such. This means avoiding haste and prejudice, and only giving credit to that which presents itself to the mind clearly and distinctly. Clarity and distinction are the 2 pillars of Cartesian truth. Something is clear when it is present and manifest to an attentive mind, and it is distinct when it is so precise and different from everything else that it only contains what is clear. It is a filter of intellectual purity that demands we look at ideas with the same sharpness with which a jeweler examines a diamond under a magnifying glass. The second rule is that of analysis. It is about dividing each of the difficulties examined into as many parts as possible and necessary to better resolve them. Descartes understood that complex problems are actually knots of simple problems. By breaking down a great unknown into its minimal components, we strip it of its power to intimidate. It is the technique of divide and conquer applied to epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that studies how we know things. If you want to understand how an engine works, do not look at it as a block of steel. Study it bolt by bolt, valve by valve. The third rule is that of synthesis. Once the problem is decomposed, we must conduct our thoughts in order, starting with the simplest and easiest objects to know, to ascend little by little, as if by degrees, to the knowledge of the most complex. It is a process of logical reconstruction. After analysis, which is a destructive and simplifying force, comes synthesis, which is a constructive and architectural force. It is like putting the engine back together after having cleaned each of its parts, ensuring that every connection is perfect. Finally, the fourth rule is that of enumeration or review. It consists of making such comprehensive counts and such general reviews that one can be sure of omitting nothing. It is the final quality control. In a world where the human mind is prone to error and forgetting, constant repetition and review are the only safeguards against logical slips. These four rules, which seem simple, are actually a manifesto against superstition and magical thinking. They propose a world where order and measure are the only sovereigns. However, Descartes was a pragmatic man. He knew that while one is dedicated to tearing down the walls of their intellectual house to build a new one, they need a place to live. One cannot stop acting while thinking. Therefore, before plunging into the abyss of doubt, he established what he called a provisional morality. This morality consisted of a set of rules of conduct so as not to remain irresolute in his actions while reason forced him to be so in his judgments. The first rule of this morality was to obey the laws and customs of his country, preserving the religion in which God had given him the grace to be instructed since his childhood. This shows us a prudent Descartes, who is not seeking political or social revolution, but internal transformation. The second maxim of his provisional morality was to be as firm and resolute as he could in his actions, and to follow the most doubtful opinions once he had determined to do so, with as much constancy as if they were very certain. Descartes uses here the metaphor of a traveler lost in a forest. If the traveler walks in circles or stops, they will never get out. But if they choose a direction and always walk in a straight line, even if they do not know exactly where they are going, they will end up somewhere that will surely be better than the middle of the forest. It is a lesson on the importance of decision-making in the midst of uncertainty. The third maxim was to always try to conquer oneself rather than fortune, and to change one's desires rather than the order of the world. This is a clear influence of Stoicism, the ancient philosophy that teaches us that our happiness depends on what we can control, which is our mind, and not on what we cannot control, which is external reality. Once Descartes had this moral refuge, he felt prepared to apply his method to philosophy itself. He began by rejecting as absolutely false everything in which he could imagine the slightest doubt. If the senses deceive us sometimes, like when we see an oar that appears to break underwater but is straight, he decided to assume they deceive us always. If we sometimes reason poorly, as occurs in mathematical errors, he decided to reject all the reasonings he had previously taken for demonstrations. And finally, given that the same thoughts we have while awake can haunt us when we sleep without any of them being true, he decided to pretend that everything that had entered his mind until then was nothing more than the illusions of his dreams. At this point in his meditation, Descartes finds himself in an absolute vacuum. He has denied the physical world, he has denied mathematics, he has denied his own body. He is left with nothing. But it is precisely at the bottom of this abyss where he finds the solid rock he was seeking. He realizes that while he wanted to think everything was false, it was necessary that he who was thinking it was something. And observing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum in Latin, was so firm and so secure that not even the most extravagant assumptions of the skeptics could shake it. He judged that he could receive it without hesitation as the first principle of the philosophy he was seeking. It is vital that we stop here to analyze the depth of this intuition. The cogito is not a syllogism, which is a logical reasoning where two premises lead to a necessary conclusion. It is not that Descartes says, everything that thinks exists I think, therefore I exist. It is an immediate intuition. In the very act of doubting, the existence of the subject who doubts is confirmed. You can doubt that you have hands. You can doubt that the sky is blue, but you cannot doubt that you are doubting. And if you doubt, you think. And if you think, you are. This is the seed of modern individualism. The center of gravity of the universe shifts from God or nature toward the conscious subject. The self becomes the ultimate tribunal of truth. From this first certainty, Descartes begins the reconstruction of reality. He asks himself what he is and concludes that he is a substance whose whole essence or nature is nothing but thinking, and which, in order to be, needs no place nor depends on any material thing. Here is born Cartesian dualism, the radical separation between the mind, which is the res cogitans or thinking thing, and the body, which is the res extensa or the thing that occupies space. This division has deeply marked medicine, psychology, and Western science for centuries. It has allowed us to study the human body as a complex machine, a network of tubes and pulleys that follows mechanical laws, while the spirit is reserved for the realm of freedom and consciousness. However, Descartes faces a problem. Although he knows he exists as a thinking subject, he still cannot be sure that the external world is real. He could be a lonely castaway in the ocean of his own mind. To escape this solipsism, which is the belief that only oneself exists, Descartes needs a bridge to the world, and that bridge is the idea of God. Analyzing his own thoughts, he discovers that he possesses the idea of a perfect, infinite, and eternal being. He asks himself where he got that idea from. He who is an imperfect and finite being because he doubts cannot be the cause of an idea of infinite perfection. The lesser cannot produce the greater. Therefore, he concludes that this idea must have been placed in him by a being that actually possesses those perfections, that is, God. This argument, known as the ontological proof, is fundamental to Descartes' system. If God is perfect, he cannot be a deceiver, since deception is a mark of imperfection or malice. Therefore, if God has given us a very strong natural inclination to believe that a physical world exists, and if we use our reason correctly following the rules of the method, God guarantees that we are not mistaken in the fundamentals. God is the guarantor of the objectivity of science. Without God, the Cartesian edifice would collapse because there would be no way to ensure that our clear and distinct ideas correspond to something real outside of our heads. After establishing the existence of God and the physical world, Descartes devotes the fifth part of the Discourse to explaining how the universe works according to the laws of physics and anatomy. It is fascinating to see how he describes the circulation of the blood and the functioning of the heart. Although he makes biological errors that seem obvious to us today, his approach is strictly mechanical. For him, animals are like automatons, biological machines without souls or consciousness. This mechanistic view of nature was the engine that drove the scientific revolution. By stripping nature of spirits and mystical forces, he turned it into something that humans could study, measure, and eventually master. But this ambition for mastery was not out of pure vanity. In the sixth and final part of the book, Descartes reveals the ultimate purpose of his method. It is not just about winning arguments in universities, but about becoming masters and possessors of nature. Descartes dreamed of a medicine based on scientific principles that could free us from an infinity of diseases, both of the body and the mind, and even from the weakening of old age. His goal was the improvement of the human condition through knowledge. This is the promise of modernity, that reason applied to matter will bring us progress, health, and well-being. Now, seen from our perspective in the 21st century, Descartes' legacy takes on complex and sometimes disturbing nuances. His separation between mind and body is today the great debate of neuroscience. Modern experts have pointed out what they call Descartes' error, arguing that the mind is not an entity separate from the body, but a process that emerges from the physical interaction of the brain with its environment. We are not ghosts in a machine, but biological organisms where emotion and reason are indissolubly linked. However, the Cartesian concept of consciousness remains the central enigma of modern science. How is it that a handful of neurons exchanging chemical signals produces the subjective sensation of being alive and being a self? Descartes' influence also extends to the field of artificial intelligence. When we design algorithms that try to replicate human thought, we are following the path of analytical decomposition that he proposed. The famous Turing test, which seeks to determine if a machine can think, is in many ways a response to the Cartesian challenge. Descartes claimed that a machine could never use words like we do to declare its thoughts to others, nor adapt to the contingencies of life with the versatility of human reason. Today, with increasingly sophisticated language models, we are testing that boundary. We are creating automatons that are no longer just metal and pulleys, but code and probability. Even in popular culture, the myth of methodical doubt lives on. The premise of movies like The Matrix, where humanity lives in a digital simulation, is a technological update of Descartes' evil genius. That hypothetical entity the philosopher imagined to test his certainty, a being dedicated to manipulating our perceptions so that we live in a constant lie. The difference is that while Descartes used that doubt to reach the truth, we often use it as a refuge for cynicism. We live in an era of post-truth, where distrust in the senses and institutions has reached a level that even Descartes would find excessive. However, the fundamental message of the Discourse on the Method remains of vital urgency. In a world saturated with information, strident noises, and prefabricated opinions, Descartes' invitation to doubt everything that does not present itself with clarity and distinction is an act of intellectual resistance. The method is not just for scientists, it is a tool for daily life. It teaches us not to be carried away by the crowd, not to accept half-truths just because they are comfortable or because many people repeat them. It teaches us that true authority resides not in ancient books or opinion leaders, but in the honest and rigorous exercise of our own capacity to reason. At the end of the journey, what remains is the figure of a man who had the courage to stay alone in the universe to discover who he was. Descartes showed us that although the outside world may be uncertain, the very fact of our search is a proof of our dignity. We are not simply pieces of a cosmic gear, we are the eye that observes the gear and the mind that tries to understand its laws. Reason is not just a set of logical rules, it is a light we carry within to illuminate the darkness of the world. This small book, written almost 400 years ago by a philosopher who preferred to sleep late to meditate in bed, remains the birth certificate of the modern subject. It reminds us that each of us has the responsibility to be the architect of our own knowledge. It is not an easy path, and it will often lead us to dead ends or to facing uncomfortable truths. But, as Descartes himself would say, good sense is the best distributed thing in the world. And if we learn to use it with rigor, with patience, and with the humility of knowing that there will always be more to discover, we will have honored the spark of divinity that is our intelligence. As we close this exploration, we must take that productive restlessness with us, not to live submerged in paralyzing doubt, but to walk with the security of one who knows that their ground has been tested by the fire of criticism. The Discourse on the Method is not a point of arrival, but a point of departure. It is a compass that Descartes hands to us so that we, in our own time and with our own battles, may continue mapping out the real. Because as long as we keep thinking, as long as we keep asking why and how, as long as we refuse to accept the shadow for the light, we will continue to be alive in the deepest sense of the word. Through the pages of this vital essay, we have seen how thought can transform reality, how a single individual armed only with their capacity for reflection can change the course of history. Descartes did not just give us a method for science, he gave us a method for freedom. The freedom to think for ourselves, the freedom to question the established, and the freedom to seek the truth no matter where it leads us. That is the true legacy of René Descartes, and that is the adventure that awaits us every time we dare to say, with full awareness and absolute conviction, that we exist because we think. Thank you very much for joining me on this extensive and deep journey through the roots of modern reason, and I hope these ideas serve to help you question your own world with the same audacity that man did in his stove-heated room centuries ago.